Hello. In this video, we're going to look at flowers for a little introduction to flowers and look at flower parts and variation in flower parts, etc. And I'm making this mostly for field botany folks, Bio 320 at Sacramento City College, as well as plant biology students in Bio 412 at Sacramento City College. Of course, anyone's free to watch this and learn about flowers because we need more people that like plants, and flowers is a great way to start. So by the magic of technology, I'm coming to you here from Lambert Dome in Yosemite, like the conifers on my shoulder, but pretty soon we'll be going to the regular PowerPoint. So suppose you go out in nature to, say, Table Mountain like here, or you go to the desert and you see all these wonderful flowers and you're trying to figure out what they are. Of course, you can have a guide to these different locations, and most of the guides, or many of the guides, go by a flower color. That wouldn't necessarily work on this particular critter here, but let's say all the flowers you're looking at are the same, roughly the same color, some pink, purple version like this. How do you tell them apart? Well, to do this, you should know something about the flower parts. And so here's a nice flower, this primrose or primula. And here's the end of the flower stem. We have sepals, and then we have petals, and then there are other parts inside. So it's a little less exciting, but let's go to a model to look at this. So a flower is a determinate modified shoot. What does that mean? Shoot, first of all, is a stem with leaves. Okay. Modified, we mean over the course of evolution it has been modified so that the leaves no more look leaf-like. And determinate refers to the mode of growth. A normal shoot, a vegetative shoot, stem with leaves, will continue on growing and making more stem and more leaves. That is indeterminate growth. But a flower usually only grows to put on a certain number of flower parts and then it stops. So that is determinate growth. So the flower parts are actually modified leaves. And I want to remind you, in both classes, we already know about leaf attachment. If you have one leaf attached at one level or node on a stem, that is called alternate leaf arrangement because the leaves sort of alternate around the stem. They go more or less in a spiral. If you have two leaves attached at the same level or at the same node, that is opposite, okay? And if you have three or more leaves attached at the same level or node, that is whorled, W-H-O-R-L-E-D arrangement. Well, in a flower, our leaves, our modified leaves, are going to usually be in whorls. That is, we're going to have separate nodes for each flower type. Sorry, each flower part type. There are some flowers that have their parts attached in a spiral. If you know magnolia, those lovely flowers, you can follow their flower parts going in a spiral around the stem. But we'll assume they're in whorls. So the stem to a flower is sometimes called a peduncle. Why I say sometimes we'll get to in a future video when we talk about groups of flowers. We'll call it a peduncle, kind of a funny term actually. The end of the stem where the flower parts attach is referred to as the receptacle. And I like to remember this because receptacles, at least in olden times, was where you put things. So this is where we're going to put the flower parts. Working from the lowest node, we have sepals. That's one of our flower parts, one of our four flower parts. Sepals being at the lowest node, well, they'll also envelope the bud, the flower when it's in bud. So they're outermost when the flower is in bud. So they at least have a protective function. They're not always green, as in this model. Sometimes they can be colored and showy and used to attract pollinators, but they're at least protective in the bud. If we go to the next highest level or node, then we're at the petals. And petals we typically think of being as showy, as bright, they attract pollinators, usually. But if you have a wind-pollinated flower, you don't need to attract anyone, so you may not even have petals, or they may be very tiny. Moving on, it gets a little harder to see that these are modified leaves because they're not flat. But we come next to the whorl of stamens. And stamens are often referred to as the male flower parts. While that's technically incorrect, I'll also use that terminology. Stamens most often have a skinny part, a narrow part, the filament, and then at the top they have the anther, and the anther is where pollen grains are produced. Going to the last flower part, we have carpels, and in this flower we have 5 carpels. Again, the carpel is the part that comes from a leaf, evolutionarily speaking, and carpels are going to contain ovules, and ovules are going to contain eggs. We'll get to that in just a minute. Before I talk more about the carpels, let's talk about collective terms. And especially in field botany, we'll use these quite often, not so much in plant biology. But if you're talking about all the sepals in a flower, you're talking about the calyx. All the petals, you're talking about a corolla. I used to drive one of those. Anyway, and all of the stamens in a flower, well, you're talking about the man cave. Androecium is the technical term. Andro refers to male. Ecium, the O-E-C-I-U-M part, refers to house. So it's the house of male. We also have a woman cave. If we're referring to all the carpels, we're talking about the gynecium, G-Y-N-ecium, so the house of female. So again, you may say, well, the calyx is like this, or the corolla is like this. So it's good to know what these terms are. Now let's refer back to the carpels, and I want to talk a little bit more about those. Let's imagine back in evolutionary time when this really was something that looked like a leaf. It was flat, like in the upper left diagram there. And on the edges of this, we had ovules. Now, each ovule will contain an egg. And for right now, I just want you to know, or realize if you didn't already know, that each ovule will become a seed later on if the egg is fertilized. Okay, potentially will become a seed. But let's take that leaf with the ovules on the margins and fold it over so that the ovules are now inside. We have an enclosed structure. This is a carpel, okay? It comes from a leaf. Now, when we look inside a flower, sometimes it's better to refer to the female parts as pistils. It's a more general term, P-I-S-T-I-L, pistil, because a pistil just refers to a female structure or a female part. It doesn't tell you how many carpels are involved. So let's take a look at the bottom row of diagrams here. And on the left, when you open up a flower, you may have one pistil. And if we know it's made of one carpel, then we call it a simple pistil. Okay. In the middle here, maybe you have 3 pistils, 3 unfused pistils, or 5, or many. In that case, each pistil we know, okay, is a simple pistil. If you have more than one pistil in the middle of a flower, it always turns out that each structure is made from one carpel. So they're simple pistils. We, however, may have on the far right a compound pistil. If you look in the flower and you only have one female structure, one pistil, and you cut it open and you start to see, oh, it looks like it was made from several carpels fused together, that is possible. In this case, it looks like we have 3 carpels fused together, but you could have 5, you could have many, and we call that a compound pistil. And we'll get used to this as we dissect more flowers. In any case, let's take a look at the 3 parts of a pistil. Let's use that more general term. So the top part is a stigma. Sometimes you can have more than one, sometimes it's just lobed. But the job of the stigma or stigmas is to hold the pollen grains in place. So it's often sticky or feathery or both. And so if pollen lands there, it should stay there. Then we have, in most flowers, a narrow or a thin part that connects the stigma to the ovary, okay? The ovary is the business part of this pistil. We'll get to that in just a moment. So, but this skinny part is called a style, S-T-Y-L-E. And then the ovary. expanded part at the base, and it will contain one or more ovules. There are some ovaries that have just one ovule, but a lot of them, many ovaries have many ovules. So I'm going to talk about the birds and the bees, if you never got that. So pollen grains, or just pollen you can say, each one contains sperm. In fact, in flowering plants, each pollen grain actually contains 2 sperm. I already said that the ovules, each one will contain an egg. So if you have the pollen grains up here on the stigmate, you've got to get the sperm down to where the eggs are. And so a tube forms, a pollen tube forms from each grain, hopefully, and the 2 sperm travel down it. 1 sperm will fertilize the egg cell in an ovule. The other actually goes to making food for the embryo that's going to develop, called endosperm. And the ovule, after fertilization, will become a seed. Okay, it's developing seed. And then the ovary becomes a fruit. So tell all of your friends when they're eating their lovely fruits that they're eating ripened ovaries, and they'll tell you to just go away. But that's what they are. Okay, fruits, botanically speaking, are ripened ovaries. So I have some examples I just want to show you. Here's a model of a cherry, apparently. And here's the pistil in the middle, which is actually made of 1 carpel in this case. Okay, I know it says it can be made of 1 or more than 1, but in this case, it's a simple pistil. Okay. And if we look at this, this is a monkey flower. Here's the petals, etc. And this is the ovary. Here's a long style, and the stigma is over on the left end. And this is a compound pistil, because if we cut it open, we'll see that it's actually made of 2 carpels fused together. And I just love this plant. A little fuzzy picture, sorry about that. But in these flowers, you have 2 separate pistils in each flower. So each pistil is made of 1 carpel. They're simple. So let's talk a little bit more about flower variation. Okay, lovely variation of flowers. That's why I like them so much. Okay, so the number of flower parts can vary. And you may have already heard this, but monocots flowers, okay, they have their flower parts usually in multiples of 3. So maybe 3 sepals, 3 petals, 6 stamens, 3 carpels, maybe fused together. Eudicots, that is the true dicots, have their flower parts usually in multiples of 4 or 5. So you can just count and see which one you think you have. So for example, this calochortus, this yellow star tulip, beautiful thing, it is a monocot, and we can tell because there's 3 sepals. Note that they seem to be coming from behind the hairy petals. That's because they're from a node lower on the stem. And so they would be outermost when this was in bud. And so 3 sepals, 3 petals. We have 6 stamens. I'm not sure if you can see that there. And we have actually a compound pistil that's made of 3 fused carpels. This is a buttercup flower, not a native one, but it's a buttercup flower, and it's a eudicot, and you can see there's 5 petals there. We have a lot of pistils in here, so we don't worry about counting that, but we at least have the 5 petals that lead us to it being a eudicot. So we could look also to see, do we have all the flower parts present? We don't always have sepals, we don't always have petals, and sometimes we have unisexual flowers. That is, they only have the stamens or they only have the carpels, but they won't have both of them. So for instance, this manroot, okay, it's got unisexual flowers, and the female flower over here on the left, you can see that's the ovary, which develops into huge prickly fruit. And we have a cluster of male flowers. What exactly that cluster is, I'll talk about later in a future video. But we have unisexual flowers. And in this case, we have both types of flowers on the same plant. And we call that being monoecious. One house for both types of single-sex flowers. Other species of plants may be dioecious. two houses. You can have a plant that has entirely male flowers and a plant that has entirely female flowers. More flower variation, symmetry. If we're looking at shapes of the flower itself, they can have two different kinds of symmetries. So radial, like a starfish, okay? And what makes it radial is there are many planes of symmetry. So if we look at this plane here, on either side we'll get mirror images. And on this one, same thing, we'll get mirror images. So many planes of symmetry, think roughly round, but many planes of symmetry is what it really means. Bilateral, like humans, at least on the outside, we're bilaterally symmetrical. You only have one plane of symmetry where you can get mirror images. So an example of a flower that has radial symmetry, and is a monocot. This is a lovely onion, the Sierra onion, and we have our three sepals, our three petals, and radial symmetry. Bilateral symmetry in this monkey flower, our one plane of symmetry would go vertically like this, okay, so we could get mirror images that way. And I just put this in because I love this. This is Lewis's monkey flower. Beautiful, beautiful flower. Okay, so more variation. Flowers can have their parts fused, and there's two types of fusion. If you have the same kinds of parts fused with each other, they're connate to each other, or we have connation. So if petals are fused to petals, or sepals are fused to sepals, we say they're connate. We can also have different types of parts fused. So if we have, fusion, sorry, I didn't catch that. If we have stamens fused to petals, for instance, the stamens are adnate to the petals, so that's adnation. Here's our monkey flower again, and this is a really great example of having sepals that are fused together. So they're connate to form this long, big tube. So anytime you have tubes and sepals or petals, we know there's connation going on. These petals are also connate, right? Here's a boxthorn, and I cut this open so you can see inside. Not only do we have the petals connate, because there's one big tube, but also we have adnation, because you can see that these white anthers, basically the filaments go right onto the petals. So the stamens are adnate to the petals. Ovary position. Okay, I know I'm throwing a lot at you fast, but don't worry. We will practice this over and over again as we look at different flowering plant families. Ovary position, there are two positions, and we're talking about position relative to where the other flower parts attach. So if you have the ovary above where the other flower parts attach to the receptacle, then that ovary is said to be superior. It's above where the other parts attach. But if it looks like the flower parts are coming off from above the ovary, so the ovary is below, then we say that the ovary is inferior. Okay? Superior or inferior ovaries. And some other things that we'll spend more time on in field botany, but I wanted to get this introduced for plant biology students. You may have what's called a floral cup or tube, and from the top of that, it looks like that's where you get your sepals, your petals, and your stamens. But notice this is not fused to the ovary. There's a superior ovary there. That floral cup made of fused sepals, petals, and stamens is called a hypanthium. And then there's tons of flower shapes, and I just want to mention that in flowers where you have a tube, and then eventually you're going to have the petals splayed out at 90 degrees. Don't worry about what that flower shape is called, but we can have the cylindrical part is called the tube, the part that widens out is called the throat, and then the limb is where the petals go out at 90 degrees. It's called salverform if you want to know, but we will get to flower shapes later. So if you are in field botany, you can stop viewing this right now. But if you're in plant biology, we're going to use this for your lab. So I just want to go over some of these different flowers so that you can look at them in more detail. Here's a buttercup, and I already mentioned that we have a lot of separate pistils in the center, okay? Each one then is made of a carpel. And notice that we're going to get separate fruits. Each one of these spiny things was from a pistil. Penstemons, oh, wonderful genus of plants in the western United States, definitely have connate petals, okay? And here's a flower shape that we call two-lipped because you have an upper lip and a lower lip, just like our lips. And notice that there are two lobes in the upper lip and three in the lower. So we really have 5 petals that have been fused together. It's a fairly common flower shape. Opened up this one so you can see inside. And notice that we have 4 stamens, 1, 2, 3, 4. This, I'm pretty sure I got this right, that this is the stigma and style. Actually, I think that's something else. So let's go to the next one. This is the stigma and style. I don't have my glasses on, sorry. And this is not. So there's our 1, 2, or that's shadow, 1, 2, 3, 4 stamens. This is a 5th stamen, but it is sterile. And so it's called a staminode, which I'll have in the next slide. But it's a sterile stamen, that is, it doesn't produce pollen. And this is why penstemons are called penstemon, 5 stamens, because they have that 5th sterile stamen. This is one penstemon called beard tongue. Wonder why it got that name. But this is the staminode, which is really, really fuzzy and sticking way out of the flower. Monkey flower, okay? This is sticky monkey flower or bush monkey flower. And it also is two-lipped, and it has these 2 stigmas that are actually touch sensitive. It's kind of fun. If you touch them, they close up because they're sensing that pollen was deposited. If pollen was not, they will open back up. But I don't know how costly that is in terms of energy. All right, we already talked about having connate petals, connate sepals. And for the plant biology folks, we are going to learn a couple of families today. So this is a flowering plant family. That's the pea family. This is a genus of plants called lupinus that's in the pea family. And this has the typical pea flowers that we think of for this family. In reality, there's 3 subfamilies, but this is the biggest subfamily and the one you're most likely to encounter in California. And so we're going to look at this pea flower shape. And we aren't going to worry too much about the sepals. They're fused together, but we're going to look at the petals, okay? So there's a very regular structure. This is a harlequin lupin, beautiful lupin, where we have a big petal on top, which also happens to be the petal that's outermost in the bud of petals. I mean, there's still sepals on that. That is called the banner, and in this harlequin lupin, it's yellow. Then we have petals coming straight out, and those are 2 wings, and they may adhere at the tips. But if you open those up, inside you're going to have what's called a keel. And the keel is going to be made of 2 petals that are connate, fused together, and it really looks like a canoe. So looking back at a different species, the first species, this is the keel taken out, and this is made of 2 fused petals. Inside this, we'll have the stamens and the pistil. So that was the pea structure with the banner, the 2 wings, and the keel made of 2 petals fused together. And now we're going to go to flower 4, boxthorn or lycium. It's a really cool plant in the tomato potato family. These flowers have a nice tube of the corolla, as well as the calyx is also connate, or a nice tube, and then you see the lobes of the sepals up there. If we open it up like I did before, you have your adnate stamens, and you have 1 pistil with a superior ovary. And this is, I believe, a nectary down here, this red thing. It's kind of cool to look at. Okay, and it's also very, very hairy, like tomato plants are, glandular hairy. So we always have fun in class looking at iris flowers. And so we are going to do this virtually. You may have an iris flower. I told you if you did, you could get it out for this or buy one if you wanted to, but it's a good excuse to have someone buy you flowers if you can wrangle that. But anyway, so irises have very unusual flower structure. First off, let's go to the bottom because you'll find a bulge. You may have to take apart the modified leaves, the bracts that are surrounding it, but you'll find a bulge down below, and that is the inferior ovary. Then you have these beautiful parts, but what the heck is what? So there are 3 sepals, and they are petal colored. They're not green. So there's 1, there's 2, and there's 3 back there. There are also 3 petals. So 3 sepals, 3 petals. There's 1, there's 2 coming towards us, and there's 3. Okay, so they're between the sepals in terms of orientation if you look down on the flower. And then it was like, well, where's the rest of this? I mean, I don't see one style and stigma, right? I don't see the stamens, so you have to investigate a little bit. And if you lift these things up that are over the sepals, you will find there's a stamen in there. So there's 3 stamens, they're just hidden. So what are these 3 things that arch over the sepals? I lost my point of that right there, okay? Well, these are actually styles, and they look like petals, so they're called petaloid styles. So I've opened this up here, and there's the stamen. You can see the anther there. One of the stamens was under this, okay? This is the petaloid style. They're often 2-parted like this. And if you look at the very top, you might find something triangular. In this case, it's triangular. It's not always. But it looks like a little scraper. It's a little flap of tissue. And that's where the stigma is. So you can imagine, let me go back to that, sorry, that if we're a bee coming in here, okay, we come in, we may get some pollen on our back as we're going for nectar, and then we back out. The way that little scraper is oriented, it won't scrape the pollen off our back as we're going back out. But when we come into the next flower, it will scrape the pollen off our backs, and then hopefully the pollen grains will germinate, and they're going to have to go all the way down to that inferior ovary. But it's really cool structure. Take a look at irises whenever you can. Okay, hold on to your hats, class. We usually take an entire lab or half of an entire lab to start to introduce this family in field botany, but we're not going to go in as much detail in plant biology here. This daisy belongs to the sunflower family, okay? So think of daisies, think of sunflowers, okay, cosmos in your gardens, maybe you have that. All of these are in the sunflower family, and they have a very unique structure. And the first thing that I usually joke about in class is I say, if you want to be a cheap date, take one daisy or a sunflower and give it to your date and tell them that that's a bouquet of maybe 200 flowers. May not go over very well, maybe not get a next date, but you would be technically correct. Because what we think of as one flower is actually a whole group of flowers. It's called an inflorescence, this term for grouping of flowers. And we'll get to the type of inflorescence in just a moment, but we're always going to be looking at this inflorescence when we're looking at a sunflower or a daisy. All right, so let's look at this here. This is the back of that daisy. And you might think those green things are sepals, but since this is a whole group of flowers, those are not sepals because sepals go with individual flowers. So these are modified leaves. We can call them bracts, okay, general term for modified leaves. We can also call them filaries. And you may be surprised that if you eat artichokes, which I hope you do because they're lovely, those things you pull off that look like leaves and you scrape the good stuff off with your teeth, those are the filaries. Those are the modified bracts for this inflorescence. Well, not this one, but for an artichoke inflorescence. By the way, what is the heart of an artichoke? It is the common receptacle. Because what's going to happen on this, under all these flowers here, these are little flowers and these are flowers, there's going to be a common flat or domed area or other shapes. It's a receptacle for all of the flowers. They don't each have their own receptacles. They are all on a common receptacle, and that's what the artichoke heart is that you eat. Now this type of inflorescence where you have this common receptacle, maybe flat, maybe domed, is called a head. Okay, so in the sunflower family, you always have a head inflorescence. That's what we typically think of as one flower, but it's not. So this head is cut open. You can sort of see the receptacle down there and there. And we have two types of flowers here. We have ray flowers, which are these ones that we usually think of as petals. If you're doing he loves me not, that kind of thing. But those are entire flowers. And we have disc flowers, which are the ones in the center. Now, there may be other, well, there are other types of heads that have different kinds of flowers in them, but this is the only one I'm going to cover for plant biology. So, very fuzzy picture, I apologize for that. But this is a ray flower, and this is a disc flower. So you can see the disc flower, maybe you can see, has radial symmetry, whereas we have bilateral symmetry in the ray flower with this long strap. We do have an inferior ovary in both of these, and there are stamens inside of the disc flower. The sexes can be different on these, it depends, but usually the disc flowers have both male and female parts, and you can see the ovary down there. So pretty cool. Tell your friends that this is not a flower, it's a whole group of flowers. A daisy is a whole group of flowers. Another fuzzy picture. Okay, I'm going to give a brief, and I mean brief, tour of the orchid family and the flower structure there. We normally get orchids in and we look at them individually, but I'm going to have to do it by pictures, obviously. Most orchids are tropical, okay? Most of them grow up in trees so that they can get the sunlight, but we do have native orchids in California. Okay, this is one that we have in California, but this picture, full disclosure, is actually from Colorado. This is the Calypso orchid, or Calypso bulbosa. It's a beautiful orchid. And we'll just use this to talk about orchid structure in general. Orchids are monocots, okay? So we're gonna have 3 sepals and 3 petals, all right? And I think my arrows are, oh no, I can see, there we go. Yes. Here's 1, 2, 3 sepals. I'm not sure why I didn't point to that one, okay? So there are 3 sepals, and there are going to be 3 petals. There's one there, and there's one that's kind of hard to see coming out at us, okay? So they're actually between the sepals, and the other one is this big one down here, okay? So there are 3 petals, but the one that is enlarged, the lower one, is called a lip, the lower lip, enlarged petal. And if we look in the center here, we're going to find the male and female parts fused together. So the stamen and the stigmatic surface all going to be fused together. It's a really cool structure. Those of you in field botany will go into more detail on that. This is another orchid species that we can find in California. And I just put this so you can see that the ovary is actually inferior. It's usually what you're thinking of as the stem of the flower. Well, I guess I will mention for everyone that in orchids, you don't have separate pollen grains. Okay, so you don't have this dust. What you have is the pollen all massed together in what's called a pollinium, pollinia plural. And the pollen is essentially just nuclei at that point. It's all massed together. And so this packet, this pollinium, is carried from orchid to orchid, usually by bees, oftentimes very specialized bees for the orchids. And again, I already mentioned that the stamen and the stigmatic surface and the styles all merge together into what's called a column in the center of the flower, and that leads back to this ovary. And just one more picture of the inferior ovary. And I just can't stop showing cool flowers because I love flowers. But if you happen to go to the desert, and I do encourage you to do that in the spring, you can find some really cool plants. And this is indigo bush here. I mean, what's not to like in those flowers? That beautiful bright blue indigo color. The fruits look even better. And then calico flower, I think is a common name of this one. Just look at flowers. They're wonderful. You can't go wrong looking at flowers. And so I think we'll stop here and continue on. For the plant bio people, you'll have a fruit video, and actually so will the field botany people too. Stay well.